Curse Breaking by Katherine Kim. Read by Katherine Kim. The summer passed quickly, it seemed to Dain. He and Axe built a small shed that now housed a goat and a few chickens, and Axe prepared the ground behind the house for a garden while Dain studied and practiced. Once he had mastered several simple spells, he set about thinking of applications for them beyond the obvious practice drills laid out in the text. The shelves themselves seemed to be enchanted, so that they held far more books than they looked like they should. Usually they held books on the topic he was seeking, but sometimes he wandered over with no real plan, just curious, and the shelves held a staggering selection of odd and wondrous volumes. He started reading ahead in other books, learning more about history and nature and famous mages. He also came across several books that made him feel uneasy to touch and sick at heart to read. One afternoon, after finding another book that made him uneasy, Dain set it down and went to the door and called out, "Axe, are you near?" There was a moment of quiet before a distant cawing, and the rush of images of the woods from above alerted him to Axe's location. A few minutes later, Axe flew out of the trees and landed before him, shifting forms back into a man before his feet touched the earth. "I may never become accustomed to that," Dain said with a laugh. "You are amazing." Axe merely smiled back and shrugged. "What did you need?" Dain's smile faltered. "I was wondering if you could tell me about these books I keep finding. They feel wrong to me. I don't much like them, but there are so many of them." He shuddered and glanced over his shoulder. "The spells they discuss are not pleasant, nor kind, and I can't imagine what one would use them for outside of, well..." His words faltered, and Axe's face grew grave. "I know the sort of book you are speaking of." Axe started to speak again, but stopped himself. He grimaced and shook his head. "The simple answer is that not all those who lived here have been good people. And some of the good people were not strong enough to resist the lure of the darker powers." Dain could understand that, but why did the house allow them to stay then? Maybe that was the real question he needed an answer to. What were the characteristics the magic of this house looked for in a new resident? Why was such evil allowed to stay if the house itself was so good? And Dain had to believe it was, at its magically animated heart, a good soul. Why had Dain been chosen? "The house mainly looks for a master that will care for it," Axe said with a rueful smile. He reached out and patted the door frame almost fondly. "I can't blame it for that. The enchantments in the vines and in the building can do a great deal, and I can do more, but the house needs a mage. It cannot sustain itself entirely, and, to be honest with you, I don't know what would become of me should the house be badly damaged or crumble. My curse is tied to the house somehow." That was another thing. "Can you tell me about that as well?" Axe raised a brow and smiled. "Taking the day off your studies to listen to the prattle of an old man?" Dain snorted. "I hardly consider you an old man, regardless of your actual age. But, Axe, you know that's not... If you don't wish to talk about it," a thought bloomed in his mind, "or if you cannot talk about it as part of the curse, you don't have to. I'm simply being curious." Axe laughed. "No, Dain, I can talk about it. What I know of it, at any rate, which isn't much. Let us have some tea and sit comfortably while we talk, at least," he said, stepping into the coolness of the house. He put the kettle on the small stove and prepared a tray of tea things as the water heated. "Where to start? The beginning, I suppose." Axe gestured Dain to the chairs before the hearth, and followed a moment later with the tray and a pot of steeping tea. "The mage who lived here first, to my knowledge, was neither a good man nor a bad one. He was a loner who preferred his own company to that of other people, though he did occasional favors for his neighbors in the town by the river in exchange for goods or whatever he might need. There was a town there even then, so many centuries ago." Dain poured the tea and handed a cup to Axe, who blinked at it for a moment before murmuring his thanks and taking a sip. "I wasn't yet here when he lived and died," Axe began, "but I pieced together some stories to guess at the truth. He was a scholar who simply did not understand people. He preferred the quiet of this forest he grew around him as a buffer from his neighbors over the bustle of a village, though he bore no particular animosity to anyone. He enchanted this house to make his own life simpler, and encouraged the trees to grow, to provide himself with privacy. And over the years, all the magic that he wove around here built up until the house was itself a resident of the woods, and the forest was a good neighbor, for lack of a better way to put it, and attracted other magical beings to live in and protect it. Magic often attracts magic, and this place was no different. A guardian spirit emerged to watch over the whole, forest, creatures, magic, and all. Axe sent Dain a small, private smile. How do you know all this? Some, as I said, I have pieced together from notes and clues in this house and out in the forest. Much I have seen for myself. Axe sighed, and the sound told of exhaustion. How old are you? Dain asked. He had wondered, but it always felt rude and abrupt to bring up. I have been trapped here for perhaps 570 years. A bit more? It is difficult to know for certain how much time passes between one mage and the next, and not all of them stay for long. He flashed Dain a sad smile. Somewhere between 500 and 600 years is a good guess, and I'd say it was closer to the 6th century mark. Dain's jaw dropped. You have been trapped here, bound to this house, and whoever wanders through it for 600 years? Axe simply nodded and sipped his tea. Almost that, yes. Oh, Axe, that's... how terrible for you! I can't even imagine! Dain didn't have the ability to even envision it. He had spent a little over 10 years, forced to serve his brothers in the home he was born in. To be bound to a house that is not even your own home and forced to serve a series of complete strangers? For centuries? His hand started to tremble, and Dain put his cup down, afraid he would drop it, or be sick. It hasn't been entirely awful. Some of the mages were a bit like you. Kind. Thoughtful. Simply interested in living and learning. One invited his friends over so often there was always someone around laughing and drinking and enjoying themselves. The leaves in the window rattled and the house creaked. Axe laughed. Yes, I know he wasn't your favorite resident. Axe leaned toward Dain and Mock whispered, The house likes to get at least a little peace in a day, and that man much preferred his parties. Dain managed to find a small smile at the almost grumpy creak the front door gave, though his stomach was still sour. I'm glad it hasn't been all bad, at least. Axe smiled and nodded. And I have become quite fond of this house. We are friends, after a fashion. The house didn't expect me to be bound to it any more than I did when I first arrived. Dain said nothing, but began to chew on his lip. This was what he wanted to know, but felt was rude to ask. How did Axe get bound to the house? Why? Axe reached over and gently ran his thumb along Dain's mouth, freeing his lip. I was young, and full of my own strength. I had heard of the mage in the woods, though by then it was a different man. He was not like the first mage. He was... Axe frowned, choosing his words. Not cruel, but selfish. He saw nothing much past his own wants and needs. He was tired of being gawked at, as he put it, like a performing animal. He wanted people to respect and fear him, and to pay heavily for his services. When I came, curious and foolishly bold, he pretended to befriend me. Axe's shoulders slumped a bit, and he shook his head. Within a day I was caught and imprisoned, and by week's end I was cursed to serve him. Dain must have made a sound of dismay, because Axe glanced over at him and smiled sadly. I truly don't think he intended this result. He simply wanted a powerful familiar to impress the locals and frighten or drive off any threats. And I am both powerful and frightening. But as I said, he was selfish and short-sighted, and the way he worded his spell has bound me here for as long as the mages of this house need me. He finished his tea and set his cup down on the small table between their chairs. Since then, there have been kind mages, dull mages, cruel ones, and I did mention the social mage. He was fun. The door squeaked again in protest. Come now, even you enjoyed being all turned out with midwinter celebration decorations, Axe said with a laugh. The leaves seemed to sigh in reluctant agreement. I'll try to remember to celebrate properly then, Dain said faintly, and the house seemed happy. Axe, though, he was staring into the cold fireplace, lost in memory. Some of them didn't speak to me much in the time they were here. Some preferred I stay in one of my other forms. Some were more considerate, treating me more as a valued retainer than a slave. In truth, I have spent as much time alone as I have serving the masters and mistresses of this house. While I did rage for many years against my fate, it brought me no closer to regaining my freedom. In more recent years, I have made my peace with it, Axe said at last, though I much prefer mages like you. Mages who remember that I am a fellow being with a mind of my own. There is a kindness in you, despite your brother's treatment of you, or perhaps to spite it, and you are the first to treat me more like a friend than a servant. Dain sighed. No creature should be forced to do things that go against their nature or their will, and I know from some of the things you've said that you have been commanded to do some terrible things. I know that you didn't do them by your own choice, and I can see the weight of them on your soul. I hate that you have been tortured that way." "Thank you," Ax said, truly. They sat there in silence for a time, each working through their own thoughts. At last, when the tea was cold and the light had begun to take on that golden late afternoon quality, Dain asked, "What have you been doing every day that takes you so far out?" Ax grimaced. "I have been keeping an eye on your brothers and their friends. I don't trust them. You have slipped out of their control twice now, and have proven that you weren't nearly as cowed as they thought you to be. Your aggressive acquaintance, Dump, and his sidekick have been going over often to visit your brothers as well. I cannot hear what they discuss inside the house, but I do not like the looks they have while they discuss it." Dain sighed. "Yes, my oldest brother Jeremy has never lost gracefully at anything." His voice grew dry. "I doubt that having his free house labor simply take off has left him feeling well disposed towards me. And Dump has now assured him that you are still nearby. They believe you are somehow hiding in these cursed woods." Ax flashed him a vicious smile. "I may be encouraging them to remember the dangers inherent in venturing too far into the trees." "Ax, what have you done?" Dain couldn't stop the laugh that bubbled up at the thought of his brothers sneaking into the woods and then running out again shrieking. "Oh, nothing too much, I assure you. Just noises and growling from the shadows to discourage them." Ax glanced over at him from the corner of his eye. "I may have scared some of the chickens out of the yard and left some, suggestive tracks and a few deep gouges in the earth near the broken fence and on the chicken coop the night they discussed coming back here to look for you." Dain's jaw dropped open, and he stared at the side of Ax's face since his friend was very diligently studying the cold hearth again. Dain could see the ghost of a smirk on his friend's face, though, and Ax's eyes sparkled with mischief. "You have been terrorizing my brothers?" Dain finally found his voice. Ax merely glanced over again and shrugged, but the corners of his mouth were twitching. "I have simply been discouraging them, that's all." Dain gaped for another moment before the laugh started to bubble up his throat. Soon he was holding his stomach and roaring with laughter. Ax started to chuckle as well. "Their faces when they went out the next morning was worth the wait," he said, and that simply set Dain off again. When he finally gasped a few steady breaths in a row, Dain said, "I bet it was priceless. They hate those chickens, but they trade the eggs to the inn for coin and ale." Ax grinned. "I feel no guilt over the matter, especially since I watched over the birds all night to make sure they didn't suffer for their human's idiocy. I brought 2 back here for you this morning, though I think they're still recovering and haven't ventured out far from the coop." Dain felt the warmth in his chest that he was coming to associate with Ax and grinned back. It slid from a look of joyful humor into a smaller, more rueful smile. "I did wonder how I gained extra birds. You are a good man, Ax. I am sorry that you have been trapped here and forced to bend your will to that of someone who has not earned your service," he said. Ax gazed at him for a long time. Endlessly, it felt, before answering. "Thank you. It is not always terrible." Ax reached across the small table over the tea things to rest his hand on Dain's shoulder. "If I have nothing else, I think I have gained a true friend, and that is priceless to me." Dain felt the heat from Ax's hand spread through his whole body, and found he could only nod in reply. It was the next morning that the solitude of their clearing was broken for the first time since Dain hid from his brothers behind the concealing safety of his home's vines. Dain was stretching, enjoying the sun warming his skin as the day dawned, when a filthy, bedraggled man in torn, mud-stained clothing stumbled from the tree line and almost fell forward against the sudden lack of resistance against his passage. Dain frowned and watched as the man stood slowly, protecting something in his arms that was revealed, once he stood fully, to be the equally ragged form of a young child. A sharp caw, and the whisper of feathers against each other, and Ax landed on Dain's shoulder, a comforting presence. Not merely because Dain knew the man would keep him safe from any dangers, but by not putting himself between Dain and the newcomer, he told Dain that the man posed little threat. "Sir!" the man called out as soon as his eyes lit upon Dain. "There are rumors, whispers of a great wizard that lives in these woods. Please, does he live here?" "I live here," Dain said simply. Ax cawed from his shoulder, then pecked and nibbled at his hair. "I would not call myself a great wizard, but I know some magic. What is it you need?" "Master, please, my daughter." The man hurried closer and shifted his burden. A girl of perhaps 3 or 4 huddled against his shoulder. Where the rosy cheeks of childhood should have glowed, she was ashen, and there was no mischief or laughter in the dulled eyes that gazed blankly back at him. "What?" Dain stopped speaking as a wave of menacing magic reached him, and he took a step back in surprise. The man stopped, and tears dripped down his cheeks. "Please, she didn't know any better. She's just a child. Barely more than a babe. She didn't know not to take the stone from the ruins. She just followed the older children who were playing at dares and found a small thing she thought was pretty, and in her innocence she put it in her pocket. She didn't know the old witch cursed the place." The man was sobbing now. He fell to his knees. "Please, great mage, help her. She's my only little girl. I beg you, I will do anything if you can save her." Dain was frozen. He couldn't find his voice, and even if he did, he wasn't sure what he would say. He knew nothing of curses or of breaking them. He had only been learning magic for a month. What right did he have to promise this man anything? But the girl... Dain looked at her as she lay curled limply in her father's arms. There was evidence that she was usually more active. The patch in the knee of her hose spoke of a game played roughly enough to take a tumble, and she seemed healthy other than the color of her skin and her complete disinterest in her surroundings. Axe pecked at his hair again. "Sir, I can't promise anything, but bring her inside at least. I can see if there's anything I can do. What is this curse? What old witch? Tell me everything. Oh, and my name is Dain." He helped the man back to his feet and led him inside to one of the chairs by the cold fireplace, his daughter cradled in his lap. Axe fluttered his wings and perched on the back of the empty chair and peered at the girl who watched him back, the tiniest flicker of interest in her gaze. Hustling around the room, Dain gathered a pot of tea and some warm water and a few cloths to clean the mud off their hands and faces. They must have had a truly difficult journey. "I am Terry, and this is Emelina, our joy and our sunshine. Even her brothers are devastated by what has happened to her. We live in a village some 2 days' walk from here. There was a woman, some 20 years back now, who lived outside our village. She was at times called a wise woman and consulted for health potions and medicine, and other times she was called a witch and avoided. I was just a child then myself, but I remember her," he said. Dain nodded for him to continue. "She was pretty, but aloof from her neighbors, and she never seemed to spend the gold she was paid for her services, nor did she sell the gifts that the richer folk paid her with. Everyone knew that she was well off, and some of the young men tried to court her in hopes of gaining a fortune as well as a wife. Well, after many years, it was discovered that she had an understanding with the priest of a nearby temple. Such things were supposed to be forbidden to him, so when the relationship was discovered, he accused her of bewitching him and disavowed her." Dain gasped, fully engrossed in Terry's story. "How awful!" "It was. Our neighbors didn't believe the man for a moment, having had enough experience with her to know that she may have kept to herself, but she did have a code and she never wavered in it. She refused to do anything that would influence another's will, ever." Terry shifted his daughter to sit a bit higher on his lap, and she turned her cheek into his shoulder and closed her eyes with a small sigh. "But we're simple farmers and craftsfolk. Nobody with influence. So the temple sent its soldiers to capture her and take her back for trial, and a few of the younger novices and soldiers, having heard the stories of her riches, were there with greed in their eyes instead of duty." Dain had the uneasy sense that he knew where the story was going to end. "When she was being dragged away, one of the older priests, the one in charge of what passed for a trial, commanded that her home be ransacked, and all of value was to be brought to him." "I see. And upon hearing this, she placed a curse on her home to keep it intact." Dain grimaced. Terry nodded. "She did not live to return to her home, but it is still there, crumbling and mostly untouched. All the things that were taken from her home that day were returned within a week, after the deaths of all those who had a hand in removing things, as well as the man who ordered the theft." Dain sat for a while, turning this all over in his mind, still not sure what to do. He asked a few more questions, but still had no ideas until Axe flew over to the bookshelf and pecked at a large brown tome with worn silver letters. Dain obediently stood and retrieved the book, laying it on the table and opening it to a random page. He flipped through it rapidly until he did, indeed, come to a section on curses. "Do you know how long it took for the cursed men to die?" he asked over his shoulder. "I believe it took that whole week. As soon as I learned what my girl had done, I went right to the headman of our village for advice, and his wife told me of your home here, that a mage was returned to the woods, and perhaps you could help. Magic against magic." Dain hummed. Axe preened his feathers, then flapped over to perch on the back of the chair Terry huddled in, where he seemed to settle in for a long wait, making clacking noises with his beak and fluffing his feathers to amuse the child, who did seem to be watching. Master Dain?" Terry asked, nervously. Don't worry about Ack. He's perfectly friendly unless you intend violence, Dain said absently, peering at the pages and trying to translate the bits of the treatise that weren't easily recognizable. He reached over to pull one of the many dictionaries down and flipped through it. The day passed, and he was vaguely aware of Ack's cawing and flapping, wordlessly encouraging Terry to carry his daughter into the bed, then leading Terry to the kitchen to rummage through the cupboards for food. He knew they were moving around, and dimly heard Terry talking to Ax as one does to an animal, and then to Emmeline in the other room, with short, quiet responses from the girl. Mostly, though, his mind was focused on the task at hand, and before he really knew it, the world outside was dark. A hand fell on his shoulder and pulled him from the stack of books that surrounded him on the table, and he drove his fingers through his hair as he sat up, expecting to find Terry, since Ax seemed to prefer his feathered form in front of their guests. He guessed wrong. "It is very late," Ax said, grinning. "Terry and his daughter are asleep in your bed, but I have made up a little nest for you by the fire. You should rest." Dain blinked. "Late?" He looked out the window and was surprised by the dark. "How long have I been sitting here?" "Since breakfast. You have worked all day." Ax led him over to one of the chairs by the fireplace, where a nest of blankets and pillows was indeed spread out by the hearth. Within a few minutes, he found himself seated with a plate of food, and Ax hovering nearby to ensure that he ate it. "Did you find anything that would help?" Dain pursed his lips and took a bite of the stew to consider. "I think so," he said slowly. "It can wait until morning, though. I have 2 methods I'd like to try." He took another bite and chewed the vegetables slowly, a frown growing as he did so. "What is wrong, young Master Dain?" Dain shot Ax a glare before he swallowed, and answered, "Don't you start with that. But how did Terry find us?" "I'm glad he did. That sweet girl doesn't deserve to be cursed. She is far too young to have done anything deserving of that fate, and I suspect that the witch would be upset to hear how her curse went awry. But the woods reshaped themselves to protect us. And you also seemed content to let them not only into our clearing, but our home. Not to even begin on the fact that somehow people know that the woods are again occupied by a magic user." Ax tipped his head and thought for a moment, considering how to answer. "Terry has an aura of desperation and grief. There is no deception or sense of violence there. He is telling the truth, and I can see that as clearly as I can see the hair on his head. I am not sure how to explain that ability, only that I have it," he said. He tipped his head back to rest on the back of his chair and eyed Dain. "The woods, though? They allow whoever they wish through. Certainly they take the master of the house's preferences into account, but in all my years here, and as connected to the woods as I am, I have not been able to understand what governs its choices. And you did not make much mystery of where you came from and returned to on market day. People there know what that signifies. The village you came from is relatively new and likely does not know the full history here." Dain had not expected any of those answers, but one stood out. "You can sense truth?" Ax sighed and closed his eyes. "I can see intention, I suppose is the closest way to put it. When I wish to tell when someone lies or speaks the truth, if they intend violence or peace, things of that nature. I will always tell you if you need to be cautious, but over time you will likely be able to tell yourself, though you shouldn't need to worry overmuch. It seems to be the nature of the magic of this place to attract like to like. You are a kind young man. You are more likely to find others who are honest and seek help for genuine reasons, rather than those who are greedy and wish harm. Though I must warn you that there will be those who come here, as the priest-judge did to the witch's house, with greed in their heart." "But I have nothing of value." Ax smiled softly and took the empty bowl from his hand. "You yourself are valuable, Master Dain, as is your power, and I would not have you harmed because of it." Dain leaned back in the chair to consider this, and before he came to any sort of reasonable thought on it, sleep came to claim him. Dain woke, wrapped in a blanket in the chair, to the soft sounds of someone trying to be quiet in the same room, and the smell of tea. He sat up from his slump and freed his arms from the blanket to rub sleep from his eyes. "Oh, Master Dain, did I wake you? I am so sorry." Terry's apology came from behind him, and when he turned, Dain found the man seated at the table drinking tea with an empty, crumb-covered plate near his elbow. "I hope you don't mind that I made myself a small meal. I have been awake for some time, and—" Dain simply waved the man's question off, not fully awake yet. "Not at all. It's fine. Is there more tea?" "Of course." Terry hopped up and took his plate and mug with him to prepare another meal. "Your familiar pecked at the teapot several times and seemed to indicate that I should make some tea for myself, then flew out the window. Are all familiars so intelligent?" Dain smiled as he stood and shook out the blanket and began to tidy up the chair. "I wouldn't know, to be honest with you. Ax is the only familiar I have ever met, But to tell you a secret, he is likely smarter than I am." Dain chuckled. Terry smiled politely and set the refilled teapot on the table, then went about making more toast. "So I think I have an idea of how to proceed, but I have a question for you. Did you know this woman, the witch?" Dain asked after his first sip of tea. "More like I knew about her, really. I did see her sometimes, but I didn't ever speak with her. I was rather young at the time, you see." Dain nodded. "I do. But do you recall if she was a cruel person? Was she vindictive?" "No, not at all," Terry answered immediately. He shook his head to emphasize it. "No, she wasn't overly friendly and kept to herself in her home for the most part. But she always had a polite word and a smile for those she met in town or at the market. She would help most anyone who asked, regardless of how much they could pay her. I do remember that. She would sometimes take a single coin or a loaf of bread for her work, and I do remember that she always had a kind word for the children she met as she went about her day. Those of us in the village always thought of her as a bit odd, but who among us isn't? We always did wonder where the rumor started about her supposed wealth, though. As far as we knew, she was no richer than any of us." Dain nodded. "I see. So, I believe she panicked. She was angry and scared when she cast this curse, and I truly don't think she ever intended it to harm a child. So, we will start with the gentlest solution. Is your daughter well enough this morning to be moved?" "She is, Master Dain. Even if she were not, I would do whatever needs done to save her life." Terry's eyes burned with determination. "I would gladly give my own life for hers if the curse needs a victim." "I don't think it will come to that, Terry. I have a few things to try, though I must warn you again that I have never attempted to break a curse. I will try everything I can think of, but I cannot promise you that it will work." He hated to think that he would fail that little girl, but he had to be honest. "I understand, and I thank you for it. Whatever you ask in payment, I will provide." Dain shifted in his seat slightly, uncomfortable, and stared down at his cup for a moment. Outside, Axe cawed a greeting before swooping in through the window over the sink. He landed lightly on Dain's shoulder and pecked gently at his hair. "Good morning to you as well." Dain didn't even think before he reached up and ruffled the feathers around Axe's neck and head as if he were a natural bird. Axe chuffed into his hair and settled in to ride around for a while. "Have a good patrol?" Axe chuffed again, and Dain suddenly saw the quiet woods in the early dawn, deer stepping delicately through the brush to find another grazing spot, the village that he thought vaguely of as his home, already bustling with people just starting their day, his brothers and Dump trudging sourly out to a field. Then last, the ivy house, nearly glowing in the early sunshine, and a sense of warmth and home and contentment washed over him. I'm glad," Dain said softly, and Axe fluffed his feathers and resettled again. "Do you think we'll have trouble with them again, or can we relax?" Axe clacked his bill and seemed to grumble, and Dain chuckled. "Well, we'll be ready for them then." "Master Dain." Terry's voice was odd, and his eyes were wide as saucers when Dain looked up at him. "Yes?" Dain glanced around the room, looking for what had startled the man. "You're familiar. You—" His jaw worked for a moment, trying to decide what words to form. Then he shook himself and turned away, muttering about how Dain was a mage, and of course he could talk to his familiar, and how it was less surprising that Axe would respond than that his wife would accept his courtship. Now that was a damned shocking thing, that was. Dain stifled a laugh at the hushed comments. Terry continued muttering to himself as he tidied up the last of the breakfast things, and Dain and Axe shared a moment of amusement. "All right then, Terry, I'm going to gather a few things. If you could get Emelina ready? I have a tunic she can wear. We will try the water first, as it is the gentlest way, I found. I think it will work, since the intent and spirit of the curse was not meant to affect innocent children, no matter how she worded it." Dain moved around the room, gathering herbs and a few bottles before stepping softly into the bedroom and pulling a clean tunic from a chest. The material was thin enough to not hamper the girl's movements should she rouse, and the green color it was dyed would perhaps be pleasing to her, he hoped. He handed the clothing to Terry and stepped outside to prepare a tub of water. The sun was plenty warm enough to take the chill off the creek water he hauled into it, and when he was satisfied, he hauled some more up to pour into his cauldron inside, before gathering the herbal components to the spell. An hour later, he nodded his satisfaction at the brew he had created. He stepped back to let it cool a bit, and to take a moment to himself. "I hope this works," he muttered, chewing on his lip and frowning. Axe muttered cheerfully and nipped at his ear. "I know, it's just that I haven't tried anything like this before. It's not like creating fire or moving things or any of the potions I've brewed until now," Dain said. He swallowed and sighed. "This is important. I can't make a mistake here. That little girl deserves to live. She shouldn't pay the price for old men's greed and selfishness." Dain felt the weight of Axe's regard and glanced over to see the bird on his shoulder, tipping his head and staring at him. "She is 4 years old, Axe. How could she possibly deserve this?" Dain huffed. He reached for a heavy cloth and lifted the pot with the potion in it and took it to the waiting bath. As soon as he put the pot down, his mind was filled with soft, sun-drenched images. Another deer in a glade cleaning a tiny fawn. Birds in a field swooping and diving, seemingly just for the joy of it. A fox running into a sunny patch of grass and leaping and rolling with a foxy grin before curling up in some dappled sunshine, tucked into the foot of a tree for a nap. Then the images shifted slightly to a wolf, bloody and injured from a fight, snarling at an equally wounded bear. Behind the wolf whimpered 3 tiny cubs, barely more than balls of fluff, so small Dain had to wonder why they were out of their den at all. The bear grumbled, and the wolf darted in for another attack. After several more exchanges, the bear finally backed up and lumbered away, and the wolf dropped to the ground, exhausted, but not so much that it didn't turn to check on its children, sniffing and licking at each of them. Dain's vision cleared, and Axe bit gently at his ear again, telling Dain that he, too, could rise to the occasion when it was necessary. "I'm not that strong," Dain said. His face felt hot, and he hoped that Axe could not see his blush. Axe simply chittered softly and fluffed his feathers in rebuttal. Dain hoped that Axe's faith in him was not misplaced. "Okay, now the spell circle, and then we'll bring Emelina out." He took a great deal of care drawing the sigils around the small tub, and he went back to the book to make certain that he had the chant correct. It was after lunch when finally he was satisfied. He tested the water to make sure it was warm enough to be comfortable. Then with a deep breath, he called Terry out. Emelina lay in her father's arms, awake now but staring blankly at the world around her. She looked fragile and small in the too large green tunic. "I do not know if this will work, or what the results will be," Dain told the frightened father. "The books all indicated that this would be effective, since your daughter was never meant to be caught in this curse. But should this not work, I have other ideas, and I will keep trying." Terry nodded. His face was grim, but there was a tiny spark of hope in his eyes, and Dain hoped with all his heart that he wasn't about to extinguish it. "Thank you, Master Dain." Dain still didn't feel that he deserved the title, but again he let it pass. Arguing with Terry would only waste his breath, and if it made the man feel better to call him such, then any comfort he could provide was worthwhile enough. Axe shifted on Dain's shoulder as if agreeing with his thoughts. Could Axe hear his thoughts? That was a startling idea, and one that Dain would have to discuss with the man. When Axe sent those images to his mind, Dain always answered him out loud, assuming that his thoughts were not projected in a similar manner. He was sure that he did not want anyone else to know that much about him. If Axe knew what he thought about in the evenings as they sat together and chatted, quietly teasing and learning about each other, he felt his face heat again. Shaking himself out of that distraction, he focused on the spell ahead of him. Terry carefully placed his daughter in the water so that she leaned against the side of the round tub, but was submerged up to her shoulders, and stepped back as Dain indicated. Dain took up the still warm potion, and after a deep breath, he started chanting. Immediately he felt magic flow around him. The sigils he had carved into the dirt around the tub started to glow, and with each repetition of the chant, brightened until they seemed to reflect the sun itself. Dain's hair stood on end all over his body and crackled with the power he channeled. The sensation of nature's strength and growing things and life swelled around him and flowed through his body, waiting to be directed, and when he judged it time, he poured the potion into the bath. "With this spell, I release Emelina from the curse that afflicts her. I return the curse to its intention and turn it back to its purpose. From now until the end, release Emelina and afflict no more innocents." He held his cupped hand over the water and said a word of command that lit his hand as bright as the sigils and just as golden. When he turned his hand, the magic poured from his palm like warmed honey, and when it touched the water imparted a softer glow to it, more like the cool, sweet moon's light than the bright sun. Even Axe was hushed and still, waiting to see what happened. The magic had flowed easily through Dain, which made him feel like he had drunk far too much ale, and he knew that Axe had helped him channel all that power. It was the largest spell he had yet tried by far, and as the magic's glow began to fade, his shoulders drooped as well. He was ready to turn to Terry and assure him that there were more options when the sound of splashing water stopped him. Emelina was stirring in the bath. "Papa?" Her voice was weak still, and sounded like she had been ill, but it was the first word she had spoken since they arrived, and was perhaps the sweetest sound Dain had ever heard. "My sweet girl!" Terry sobbed and shuffled at the edge of the circle. Dain knew that the man was being careful not to disturb the sigils around the tub, so he stepped forward himself to scoop the girl out of the water. "Welcome to my home, young lady," Dain said with a grin, as she eyed him nervously. "My name is Dain, and this is Axe. Let's get you out of this water and over to your papa, She nodded, and reached up to hold on, and giggled when Axe fluttered his wing over her arm. When he handed the girl to her father, she wrapped her arms around Terry's neck in a tight hug. The man wept, unashamed to show his relief. Dain's heart felt full, and he still buzzed with residual magic. Take her inside and get her dry and fed. Stay here again tonight, both of you. I won't send you into the woods in this state," Dain said. He felt he could not stop smiling if he was threatened with death. "Rest, recover further, and you can take your leisure traveling home. I am sure that your family is worried." Terry simply nodded and turned to the house. Axe rubbed his feathered head against Dain's jaw and cheek before hopping away and then flying after the pair. Dain sighed and sank to the ground to lean on the side of the tub and took several deep breaths. It had worked. Praise to all the gods, major and minor, it worked. Dain wasn't sure why, but he sat there, surrounded by the now inert symbols and a tub full of expended magic, and sobbed his relief in the privacy of his solitude. As the tears dried slowly, another thought fluttered through his mind. If he could break this curse, perhaps he could break another. The next morning, Dain waved goodbye to Terry and Emelina, with Axe preening and cawing from his shoulder. Terry was full of gratitude and praise for Master Dain, and Emelina was a joyful ball of giggles. She played gleefully with Axe and couldn't wait to tell her mother all about the wizard's pretty bird. Dain refused all payments from Terry, though he did accept a small drawing of Dain and Axe that Emelina had done on a scrap of paper as she waited for dinner the previous evening. Dain thought to pin it on the wall of his bedroom. "We will never forget your kindness, Master Dain," Terry swore. "I can never repay this debt." Dain shook his head. "I have been repaid. I have a beautiful drawing to decorate my home, and I have learned a great deal. I am not so experienced that I take these things for granted." After a few more attempts, Terry finally took his daughter's hand, and they walked away toward a path that Dain was fairly certain had not been there before. He shrugged, and when the pair disappeared from view, he turned back to the house. "That was very well done," Axe said, a small smile on his lips and what Dain hoped was pride shining from his friend's eyes. "I certainly learned a lot. I might never have tried anything that big without the push to help them." Dain smiled and finished clearing up the breakfast things. Terry had insisted on making dinner the night before, as well as breakfast before he left, and he had also looked after Dain's animals while he was deep in his books. Dain had insisted that he would tidy up after the man and his daughter left. He thought he might need a mundane task or two to help center him again after the past few days. Axe chuckled. "That as well, but I was referring to what you said to Terry about being paid for your work. This is just the beginning, you understand. More people will come to ask for magic. Potions and cantrips and curses and cures. They will come seeking all these things and much more." Dain sighed. "I had a feeling that would be the way of it. As soon as Terry told me why he was here, I knew he would be the first, rather than the only person to seek me out." He put the dishes away and then turned and leaned against the cupboard. "What happens when someone comes and they don't mean well? What if they come for me, like they did for that poor witch?" Axe stepped forward and laid a hand on Dain's shoulder, reassuring and solid. "That is where you are better served than she was. The house and the forest both will keep the worst away. And for those that do find their way here, I am here to protect you, and I promise you I am well able to do so." Dain couldn't help but tease now. "I did not know that crows were so fierce." The weight of breaking the curse on Emelina was off his shoulders, and he felt fizzy with his success, but glad that their home was once again theirs alone. It was a strange feeling to know that this place was his, and that he and Axe belonged here. Axe grinned, and his eyes flashed a golden green for a moment, and the sensation of great power and ancient magic swept over Dain, reminding him of the feel of the spell he cast to break the curse. Dain gasped, trapped in Axe's gaze. "I think I told you that I have several forms. I chose the bird when I was caught by the spell tying me to this place, and he demanded I transform myself. I rather like it, though. Much easier to fit a crow into this house," Axe said, his grin widening. "But do not worry. I have other, fiercer forms. I will keep you safe." Dain merely nodded, unable to think of anything to say. And really, he trusted Axe. Even if he had been a natural crow and not much more, Dain knew that his friend would protect him, one way or another. But whatever Axe was in truth, Dain had the feeling that the man would be capable of taking on almost anything. This feeling of safety and belonging was easily as heady and strange as the feeling of magic in his blood had been the day before, and Dain was not entirely sure what that meant.